My name is Vivian Hollis, and at 34, I found out that an empty chair can confess everything a family will never say to your face. My mother-in-law arranged a dinner at the most exclusive restaurant in the city to celebrate my husband's big career win. When I walked in, every seat at that long table was claimed, every place card engraved, every chair occupied. Diane Marsh looked at me from the head of the table and gave me the kind of smile a woman wears when she's certain she's already won. What she had failed to factor in was the man who ran that kitchen, the navy folder tucked into my bag, and one inconvenient fact, that the company we'd all gathered to toast had never, not for a single day, belonged to her son. 48 hours later, the Marshes would lose access to every dollar they'd assumed was theirs. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up. Welcome back to Quiet Justice Stories, where steady women answer loud betrayals with quiet receipts. No yelling, just the truth and the paperwork to prove it. If a woman choosing herself over a family that never once chose her is your kind of story, leave a comment below. Subscribe so the next one finds you, and let's get into it. The invitation came on a Tuesday. Ivory cardstock, gold foil edges, the kind of stationery Diane ordered from a boutique in Savannah that charged more for the envelope than most people spend on the gift inside. It read, "The Marsh family cordially invites you to an intimate dinner celebrating Daniel Marsh's landmark partnership with Howard Hotel Group." And below it, in Diane's looping cursive, Daniel and guest. Not Daniel and Vivian, guest. I held the card up to Daniel that evening while he knotted his tie for a client happy hour. "Guest?" I said. He barely glanced at it. "Mom probably ran out of room." "There's a 2-inch margin, Daniel." He kissed my forehead on his way to the door. "She didn't mean it like that." That sentence had become a load-bearing wall in our marriage. Diane didn't mean it when she cropped me out of the family Christmas photo. She didn't mean it when she introduced me at her garden club as Daniel's little helper at the office. She didn't mean it when she told the caterer at our own anniversary party that I could eat in the kitchen since I'd feel more at home there. Daniel had a gift for repackaging cruelty as carelessness, and for 6 years, I'd let him. Not because I believed him, because I was too busy running the company that made all of it possible. The foil cards, the Savannah stationery, the client happy hours. None of it would have existed without me. But nobody at that dinner table knew it yet, and the word guest was about to cost the Marshes more than they could afford. I started washing dishes at a seafood shack called Muller's the summer I turned 16. Minimum wage, no air conditioning, grease burns up both forearms by August. The head cook was a man named Sal Porcelli, 60 years old, a voice like a blown speaker, hands that could break down a halibut in 45 seconds flat. He watched me bus tables for 3 weeks without a single word. Then, one night after close, he laid an 8-inch chef's knife on the prep counter and slid it across to me. "You don't flinch," he said. "That's half the job." That knife came in a canvas roll held shut with a rubber band. The handle was chipped rosewood. The blade had been sharpened so many times, the spine had gone thinner than a butter knife. I still have it. I carried it through culinary school, through my first sous chef post at 21, through every kitchen I ran in 3 different cities, learning the parts of the restaurant business that never make it onto cooking shows. Vendor contracts, lease negotiations, labor compliance, health inspections, insurance claims. By 25, I'd filed the paperwork for Keystone Hospitality Group, An LLC with my name on the operating agreement and my savings in the capital account. Keystone didn't build restaurants. We developed them. Concept, financing, build-out, staffing, launch. I'd take a failing location, gut the menu, restructure the lease, recruit the talent, and hand a profitable kitchen back to an operator inside 14 months. I was good at the invisible work, the work that keeps the lights on while somebody else stands in front of the camera and accepts the compliment. That habit would cost me eventually, but back then it just felt like the honest way to build something. The Marshes were a family living inside a frame they'd built around a picture that no longer existed. 25 years ago, Gerald Marsh, Daniel's father, ran a development firm that bet everything on a resort outside Hilton Head. It collapsed in public. The kind of collapse that gets written up in the local business journal. The kind where the neighbors know before the kids do. Gerald drank himself into a quiet disappearance after that, dead by the time Daniel was 20. Diane was left with 2 children, a last name that used to open doors, and enough fury to rebuild a reputation out of the wreckage. She did it the only way she knew how: performance. The right country club, the right luncheon circuit, the right vocabulary. Intimate instead of small. Curated instead of cheap. She taught Daniel and Whitney that the appearance of wealth was sturdier than wealth itself, and for a long stretch she was right. People believed the Marshes were still the Marshes. Nobody bothered to check. The trouble with Diane wasn't that she was cruel. Cruel people are predictable. Diane was strategic. Every slight was calibrated. Every exclusion was deniable. She never raised her voice. She simply rearranged the room until you were standing outside it, and then looked surprised to find you there. She'd decided, the night Daniel first brought me to dinner, me at 28, still smelling faintly of fryer oil under my perfume, talking about food cost ratios instead of vacation homes, that I was a threat. Not to her son, to the story. Because a daughter-in-law who came up out of a dish pit didn't fit the frame, and Diane would break me before she'd resize it. Daniel was charming the way a hotel lobby is charming. Polished, climate-controlled, engineered to make you feel welcome without ever once letting you pass the front desk. He had his mother's jawline and his father's talent for sounding confident about things he didn't actually understand. When we met, he was managing a bar that was 3 months from shutting down. I restructured its lease, swapped the supplier, and rebuilt the cocktail program in a single weekend. He watched me do it with a dazzled admiration I mistook for respect. We married when I was 28. By then, Keystone was generating real revenue, and I needed someone to be the face, the handshake at the investor dinner, the smile at the ribbon cutting. Daniel fit the role like he'd been born for it. In a way, he had been. Diane had trained him to perform. I made him managing partner of Keystone, salaried, with a 10% equity stake carved out of my own holdings after Harrove Capital Partners had already taken 20% in a growth round I'd pitched in Charlotte the year before we married. That left me holding 70% as the majority member, with a managing partner removal clause that my attorney, Frances Doyle, had flatly insisted on. Insurance, she called it. I told her she was being dramatic. The arrangement worked because I let it stay invisible. Daniel went to the conferences. Daniel took the meetings. Daniel's name got printed on the business cards my capital had paid to print. Everyone assumed Daniel had built the company, and I never corrected them. That was my flaw. Not naivete, not people-pleasing. I was isolated inside my own competence. I believed the work should speak for itself. I carried everything alone because asking for credit felt like asking for permission. The work never spoke. It just kept working. And the silence let a false story harden until it became the only story anyone knew. The Marshes had a tradition of Sunday dinners at Diane's house. Cream tablecloth, matching napkins, a centerpiece that rotated with the season. Everyone had an assigned seat. Daniel at Diane's right, Whitney and her husband Brad across the table. Gerald's chair still empty at the head, a monument to grief Diane had never actually processed. My seat was at the far end, the short end, past the wine glasses, past the good flatware, in the spot where the draft from the kitchen door hit your neck every time someone stood up. I didn't complain. I brought dessert. I cleared the plates. I asked about Whitney's Pilates and Diane's garden club. For 6 years, I was the model daughter-in-law by every measure, but the one that counted. I was never once treated like family. The worst of it happened at Diane's 62nd birthday in front of 11 people. A photographer showed up to take a family portrait. Diane, Daniel, Whitney, Brad. They arranged themselves in front of the fireplace. I stood up to join them. Diane raised one hand, smiled for the lens, and said the sentence that would ring in my ears for the next 14 months. Staff, dear, not family. Nobody in that room flinched. Daniel coughed. Whitney adjusted an earring. The photographer took 6 frames. I went back to the kitchen and wrapped the leftovers in foil. Later that night, Daniel said she'd been joking. You know, Mom, she's got a dry sense of humor. I know dry humor. I grew up in restaurant kitchens where line cooks roast each other for sport. Diane wasn't joking. She was filing me into the category she needed me in so the frame wouldn't crack. 3 weeks before the dinner at Sen, I landed the biggest letter of intent Keystone had ever seen. Signed, pending final contract. Howard Hotel Group wanted a flagship restaurant inside their new downtown property. A 200-seat concept with a rooftop bar, a tasting room, and a build-out budget north of $4 million. I'd been courting them for 11 months. I flew to their Atlanta headquarters twice. I built the pitch deck, the pro forma, the staffing model. I sourced the architect. When the LOI came through, it was addressed to Keystone Hospitality Group LLC. Attention, Vivian Hollis, managing member. Daniel's contribution had been a handshake at the introductory meeting and a follow-up email he'd thumbed out from his phone while watching golf. But Diane's invitation said, celebrating Daniel's landmark partnership with Howard Hotel Group. His partnership. His landmark. The morning it arrived, Daniel called his mother to thank her for organizing the dinner. I listened from the hallway. Mom, it means a lot, really. This is the one that changes everything for us. Us meant the Marshes, not Vivian. The invitation named Sen, a restaurant with a 3-month waiting list and a tasting menu that started at $240 a head. A place where Diane could perform status for an audience that would buy it. What she didn't know, what nobody in that family had ever thought to ask, was how the owner of Sen got his start and who handed him his first kitchen. Some questions answer themselves if you're paying attention. The Marshes had never once paid attention to anything that didn't already have their name on it. The morning of the dinner, I drove to Francis Doyle's office on King Street. Francis was the kind of attorney who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and could dismantle a limited liability clause the way a surgeon removes a splinter. Calmly, precisely, without looking up. I'd hired her 9 years earlier to draft Keystone's operating agreement, and she'd insisted on provisions I was sure I'd never need. A managing partner removal clause triggered by a majority member vote, a non-compete with a 12-month cooling period, and a capital account reconciliation schedule that required annual signatures from every member. Daniel had signed every year without reading a single page. I handed her the navy folder. Soft leather, the color of a midnight sky, the Keystone logo embossed in the corner. Inside, the operating agreement, Daniel's signed annual acknowledgments, the capital contribution ledger, and the Howren LOI. "You want this notarized today?" Francis said. Not really a question. "I want originals certified and a duplicate set locked in your office." She looked at me over her glasses. "You're sure about the timeline?" "Monday," I said. "After the dinner." "After," she repeated. For a second, I thought she was going to ask why. Instead, she opened a desk drawer, pulled out her notary stamp, and got to work. I sat in the leather chair across from her with the folder in my lap and watched her process the paperwork. It weighed almost nothing. A few sheets of paper, a handful of signatures, a few numbers. The entire architecture of the life the Marshes believed they owned, portable enough to fit inside a tote bag. I zipped it shut when she finished and drove home to get dressed. Whitney called that afternoon. "Just confirming the head count for tonight," she said, with the particular brightness she used when she was managing something. "Diane wants to keep it intimate, close family only." "I'm close family," I said. "Of course you are. I just mean, it's a small table. We had to be selective." Selective. I pictured Whitney in her kitchen, the one Brad couldn't afford, rehearsing the word in the mirror before she dialed. "Is there a seat for me, Whitney?" A pause. 3 seconds. Long enough to hear her swallow. "I'm sure Daniel can figure something out. He's so good at that." She hung up before I could answer. I stood in my kitchen holding the phone, and something in my chest went very still. Not anger, not sadness. Recognition. I'd been here before. Outside the frame, past the good flatware, past the photographer's lens. The Marshes had a system, and I'd been cooperating with it for 6 years because it was easier to carry the weight than to set it down and watch what fell. Whitney's call wasn't a surprise. It was a confirmation. Close family. I'd remember those words. I texted Daniel. "Whitney says the table's full. Is there a seat for me?" 3 dots appeared, vanished, appeared again. His reply landed 20 minutes later. "I'll talk to Mom." He wouldn't. I knew it the way I know a kitchen is going down before the first ticket backs up. Something in the rhythm shifts. The noise goes too quiet, and you realize nobody's running the pass. Daniel wasn't running anything. He was waiting for someone else to fix it, the way he always had. Sen. The name had been drifting through the city's food scene for 4 years, attached to words like visionary and unmissable, and the kind of breathless Instagram captions that call a plate of roasted carrots transcendent. The chef-owner was Declan Hale, 39, Irish-American, built like a middleweight, with a paring knife tattooed on his left wrist and a James Beard nomination on his wall. Every profile told the same origin story. Declan Hale, self-taught prodigy, opened his first restaurant at 27 with nothing but grit and a vision. I'd read those profiles. I never corrected them, because the part they left out, the part Declan himself left out of interviews, not out of ingratitude but because I'd asked him to, was that he hadn't been self-taught at all. He'd been my line cook. 22 years old, burning stocks and overcooking risotto in a kitchen I ran when I was barely older than he was. I taught him to break down proteins. I taught him mise en place. When he was ready to open his own room, I co-signed his first commercial lease, because no bank would touch a 27-year-old with no collateral. That lease became the restaurant that became the reputation that became Sen. When Daniel said the name at breakfast, "Mom booked Senator, can you believe it?" I felt a flicker behind my sternum. Not nostalgia, not worry, Something closer to recognition. The feeling you get when a card you'd forgotten you played lands face up on the table. Nice, I said, and poured my coffee. 2 days before the dinner, I asked Daniel one more time. We were in the bedroom. He was choosing a tie, navy silk, Diane's taste. I sat on the edge of the bed with the invitation in my hand. Can you call your mother and ask her to add a seat for me? He didn't look up. It's handled. How is it handled? I mentioned it. She said the table's already set. Then I'll call the restaurant myself and add a chair. He turned, and for a moment, he wore the expression of a man about to say something honest. Then he smoothed the tie against his chest and chose the other thing. Vivian, don't make it weird. It's one dinner. Mom's been planning it for weeks. I don't want to rock the boat. The boat. I had built the boat. I'd waterproofed the hull, replaced the engine, charted the course. And the man standing in front of me in a tie his mother picked out was asking me not to rock it. I won't make it weird, I said. He smiled, relieved, grateful, already moving on. That's my girl. He kissed the top of my head and left. I sat on the bed a long time after that, not crying, not planning, just sitting with the specific weight of being someone's girl instead of someone's partner. My phone buzzed, a calendar reminder. Francis, notary appointment, 9 a.m. Friday. I stared at it, then set the phone face down on the nightstand. I wasn't going to make it weird. I was going to make it permanent. Whitney had always worked best in the margins. The whispered aside, the brunch invitation extended to everyone except the one person it concerned. She was Diane's logistics officer, and she'd been running a quiet campaign all month. I learned about it sideways, the way you learn most things in families that communicate through omission. Brad, Whitney's husband, a man whose chief professional accomplishment was getting fired from a commercial real estate firm in a market where commercial real estate firms were practically begging for warm bodies, had started turning up at Keystone functions. Not the big ones, the small, internal ones. Team lunches, a site walk at the Howeren property, a casual coffee with our project architect. When I asked Daniel about it, he shrugged. Whitney thought Brad could use some exposure. He's been down lately. Exposure to what, exactly? The business. Get a feel for things. Maybe take on a role eventually. A role. Something operational. Whitney thinks he's got potential. I poured a glass of water and drank it slowly to keep from saying what I wanted to say, which was that Brad's potential was roughly equivalent to a screen door on a submarine. Instead, I said, whose idea was this? It came up at Mom's. Whitney mentioned it, and Mom thought it made sense. Of course she did. It made perfect sense. If the plan was to slide Brad into a position currently occupied by someone Diane had never wanted there to begin with. Someone whose name wasn't on the invitation. Someone who'd washed dishes for a living before she washed up into the Marsh family. They weren't just leaving me off a dinner list. They were rehearsing my replacement. The night before the dinner, I couldn't sleep. Daniel was already out cold. He slept like a man with no conscience, which, to be fair, requires having one in the first place. I went downstairs for water, and his phone was sitting on the kitchen counter, face up, unlocked. I hadn't planned to look. I want to be clear about that. I was walking past it toward the sink when the screen lit with a notification from a group chat labeled Marsh Family. The preview showed 3 words from Diane. She's staff. Staff. And then it cut off. My hand stopped on the faucet. The kitchen was dark except for the blue glow of that screen. I'm not the kind of woman who goes through her husband's phone. I track invoices and vendor contracts and compliance reports. I read documents for a living, and I've read enough of them to know that information doesn't care how you find it. It only cares whether it's true. I picked up the phone. The full message was waiting. 43 messages over the past 2 weeks. I read them standing in the dark, bare feet on cold tile, with the same focus I'd use on a contract where someone was trying to bury a clause. The first thread was Diane coordinating the seating chart for Senator. She'd listed every name: Daniel, Whitney, Brad, the Calloway cousins, 2 garden club friends, a representative from Howren Hotel Group, so they can see the whole family behind Daniel's success. No Vivian. Perfect, Whitney had replied. Keep it tight. 12 messages down, a thread that made my jaw set. Diane. We need to talk about the company. Daniel should be the sole face going forward. Vivian can step back. She's operational. She doesn't need a title. Whitney. Brad can handle the operational side. He's motivated. Diane. Exactly. Daniel runs the client relationships, Brad handles operations, and Vivian can consult quietly. Whitney. Does Daniel know? Diane. Daniel will do what makes sense for the family. He always does. Earlier in the thread, Whitney had asked, Doesn't Vivian have some kind of stake in the company? And Diane's reply, Daniel says it's mostly his. She helps with the day-to-day. He'd told them. He'd let his own mother believe the company was his, and she'd built a takeover plan on a lie he was too comfortable to correct. The next message was from Daniel. A single thumbs-up emoji. No pushback. No, wait. She founded the company. No, maybe we should talk to her first. A thumbs up. Yellow and hollow, floating in a thread where his mother and sister were planning to strip his wife of the company she'd built with her own 2 hands. Further down, Diane had written about the dinner itself. No seat for her. If she shows up, she'll get the message. If she doesn't, even better. And then the line that landed like a fist. She's staff. Staff doesn't sit at the family table. There it was. Not a joke, not a slip. A strategy, typed out in complete sentences, coordinated across 3 Marshes who'd all agreed, including the one sleeping upstairs, that I was something to be managed, rearranged, and eventually removed. I set the phone back on the counter, screen down, exactly where I'd found it. My hands weren't shaking. My pulse was steady. I went back upstairs, opened my laptop, and sent Frances Doyle a 2-line email. Proceed with the notary on Friday. Bring a second set of the Howren LOI. Then I closed the laptop and lay down in the dark beside a man who'd given me a thumbs up. Friday morning, I sat across from Frances while she notarized the documents. The Navy folder lay open on her desk, the operating agreement, the capital contribution ledger, Daniel's signed annual acknowledgments, and now the Howren LOI. I'd seen these pages 100 times, but that morning they read differently. Article 3, Membership Interest. Vivian Hollis, 70%. Daniel R. Marsh, 10%. The remaining 20% held by Keystone's institutional investor, a fund that had backed me, not Daniel, on a pitch I'd made in a conference room in Charlotte the year before we married. Article 7, Removal of Managing Partner. A majority member could initiate removal with 30 days written notice for cause or 60 days without. Cause included material breach, failure to perform duties, or conduct detrimental to the company's reputation or operations. Frances slid the notarized copies across the desk. The removal notice is drafted. You just need to sign. Monday. Monday works. She paused. You know they'll claim it's retaliatory. They can claim whatever they want. I've got 9 years of signed acknowledgments proving he knew the terms. She nodded. And tonight? I'm going to the dinner, even without a seat, especially without a seat. I zipped the folder shut and tucked it into my bag. The leather was soft, almost weightless. A few sheets of paper. The real weight had never been in the documents. It was in the 6 years I'd spent pretending they didn't matter. Francis walked me to the door. Vivienne? I turned. Don't lose your temper tonight. Whatever happens, you've got the paperwork. That's enough. I drove home with the folder on the passenger seat and the radio off. That afternoon, I called Keystone's project coordinator and confirmed the guest list. The Howard rep, I said. Patricia Engel. She's attending? Confirmed. She RSVP'd through Diane's office. Good. Patricia Engel was Howard's vice president of development. She'd sat across from me in Atlanta twice. She knew my name. She knew my pitch deck. She knew the square footage projections, the revenue model, the staffing timeline, because I'd built every line of it. What she did not know was that the man she'd been introduced to as the founder at a cocktail reception 3 months earlier was a salaried managing partner with a 10% stake and a tie his mother had picked out. Tonight she'd learn that. Not because I planned a speech, not because I planned a scene, because the truth is a quiet thing, and the moment you stop covering for it, it tends to walk into the room on its own. I stood at the kitchen counter and reviewed the evening the way I'd review a restaurant opening. Logistics, timing, exits. I wasn't angry. I was clear. Clarity is what arrives once you finally stop translating someone else's cruelty into a language you can live with. If you've ever sat at a table that pretended you weren't there, you already know the silence I carried that week. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I just kept reading the one document none of them thought to ask about. Stay with me. The dinner is where everything turns. And if quiet women winning is your kind of story, subscribe so the next one finds you. I got dressed at 6. Black sheath dress, low heels, small earrings. Nothing that announced itself. My tote sat on the bed with the navy folder inside, beside my keys and a tube of lipstick I'd probably forget to reapply. Across the room, on the shelf above my desk, my old knife roll lay coiled in its rubber band. I looked at it for a long time. Sal's knife. The chipped rosewood handle, the blade gone thinner than a credit card from a decade of sharpening. It had been everywhere with me. Every kitchen, every build-out, every late night prepping for a soft open. It was the most honest thing I owned. For one strange moment, I considered bringing it. Not as a weapon, as a talisman, something to ground me when the room tilted. Then I left it on the shelf. I didn't need a knife tonight. The tool I needed was already in my bag, and it was sharper than anything Sal ever put to a whetstone. Daniel was already at Sen. He'd gone early to help Mom with the setup, which meant standing in the foyer with a glass of Prosecco while Diane directed the staff like a 4-star general. The house was quiet. I checked my reflection in the hallway mirror. Calm, steady. A woman who'd been washing dishes since 16 and building companies since 25, about to walk into a room full of people who thought she was nobody. I picked up my bag. The folder shifted inside, settling against the lining like a heartbeat. Don't fight for a chair, I told the mirror. You own the building. Then I locked the door behind me and drove to Sen. Sen occupied the ground floor of a converted cotton warehouse on East Bay Street. Exposed brick, iron beams, candlelight that turned the whole room amber. The kind of place where the bread course alone costs more than my first week's pay at Muller's. I gave my name to the hostess. She scanned her list, scanned it again. I'm sorry, I don't see a reservation under Hollis. Try Marsh. She brightened. Of course, the Marsh party, right this way. She led me through the dining room to a long table beneath a wrought iron chandelier. 14 seats, 14 place cards, each engraved in copper ink on heavy cream stock. I counted them as the hostess consulted her seating chart. Diane at the head, Daniel to her right, Whitney and Brad across, the Calloway cousins, the Garden Club women, a man I recognized as Howerin's regional director. Not Patricia Engel, I noted. The bigger gun was coming later. And 3 names I didn't know. 14 cards, 14 chairs. I walked the length of the table. My name was on none of them. The hostess stood behind me, quiet, waiting. Every person at that table was already seated. Daniel looked up from his wine glass. Whitney smoothed her napkin. Brad stared at the bread basket. And Diane. Diane sat at the head with both hands folded over her place card, smiling at me the way a woman smiles when the room is arranged exactly the way she designed it. The chair wasn't missing by accident. This was the message. I was meant to feel it, absorb it, and leave. The empty space where my seat should have been was louder than anything anyone at that table could have said. I stood at the end. 14 faces pointed at me like a jury. The chandelier hummed. Somewhere in the kitchen, a plate clattered. Diane tilted her head and said it. The line I'd been hearing in variations for 6 years, now delivered at full volume in front of every person who mattered, in a restaurant that charged $240 a plate. Maybe a budget place suits you better. The table laughed. Not all of them. Daniel didn't laugh. He stared at his fork. Brad coughed into his fist. But the Garden Club women laughed. The Calloway cousin at the far end laughed. And Whitney let out a small, bright sound she tried to disguise as clearing her throat. Diane's smile didn't waver. She had rehearsed this. The seating chart, the missing card, the line. It was choreography. She wanted me standing. She wanted the room to see me standing. And she wanted me to understand, in front of 14 witnesses, that this table and this family and this company and this life had no space for a woman who once washed dishes for a living. I looked at her. I looked at the empty stretch of table where a 15th card should have been. I looked at Daniel, rotating his wine glass by the stem, saying nothing. Then I did the one thing none of them expected. I laughed. Not a polite laugh, not a nervous one, a real one, the kind that starts in the belly and keeps going because it has nowhere else to go. Diane's smile flickered. Something funny? I set my bag on the floor, straightened my dress, and turned to the nearest server. Could you ask the owner to come out, please? The server hesitated. He looked at the table, then at me, then toward the kitchen. The owner? Declan Hale. Tell him Vivian is here. Something shifted in his posture, a straightening, a recognition. He nodded and walked to the kitchen without another word. The table went quiet. Diane's smile was still in place, but the architecture behind it was moving. Whitney leaned over and whispered something to Brad. Daniel set his glass down and looked at me, for the first time all evening, with something other than avoidance. Confusion, maybe, or the beginning of dread. I stood and waited. I didn't explain. I didn't fidget. I folded my hands in front of me the way Sal had taught me to stand during service. Still, grounded, ready. The kitchen door opened. Declan Hale walked out, wiping his hands on a towel, still in his chef's coat. The moment he saw me, his whole face changed. His eyes crinkled. His shoulders dropped. He crossed the dining room in 4 strides and folded me into a hug that smelled like brown butter and thyme. "Chef," he said. Not Vivienne. Chef. That one word dropped into the room like a stone into still water. The ripples spread outward. The garden club women stopped talking. The Calloway cousin put down his bread. Patricia Engel, who'd arrived sometime in the last 5 minutes and was standing near the bar with her coat still on, turned her head. Declan pulled back and looked at me with plain warmth. "We saved your seat. We always save your seat." He turned to the hostess and spoke with the calm authority of a man in his own kitchen. "Chef's table. Set it. Now." The chef's table at Sen was a 6-seat counter that looked straight into the open kitchen. The best seat in the house. The one that ran $400 a head with a waiting list longer than the dining rooms. Declan pulled out a chair for me himself and laid a fresh place card on the counter. Copper ink on cream stock. Vivienne Hollis. I sat down and the kitchen crew, 3 line cooks, a pastry chef, a Sioux who couldn't have been older than 24, looked up from their stations and nodded. One said, "Chef." Another lifted a ladle. They knew who I was. They'd always known. Because Declan told every cook who walked into his kitchen the same story. I got my first shot from a 23-year-old woman who ran a kitchen like a surgeon runs an OR. She signed a lease for me when no bank would. Everything I built started in her kitchen. He told me that once, over drinks, after Sen earned its first major review. I'd asked him to stop telling people. He'd looked at me like I'd asked him to stop breathing. I'll stop when it stops being true. He never stopped. The dining room was recalibrating. I could feel it the way you feel a room's temperature change. Not all at once, but a degree at a time. The garden club women were leaning into each other. The Calloway cousin was typing something on his phone. And at the long table, Diane sat with both hands flat on the cloth, watching me with an expression I'd never seen on her before. The frame she'd spent 25 years building had just cracked, and the sound hadn't reached her yet. Declan brought the first course himself, seared scallops with a saffron beurre blanc, the dish that had earned him the Beard nomination. He set the plate in front of me and leaned against the counter. "Still got the knife Sal gave you?" I smiled. "On the shelf at home." That knife taught me more than culinary school. You, holding it over a cutting board at 7 in the morning, that's the first thing I picture when I build a menu. He said it loud enough for the dining room to hear. Not because he was performing, because Declan never learned how to be quiet about the things that mattered to him. The long table was watching now, all 14 faces. Daniel had gone pale. Whitney was gripping the edge of her napkin. Brad looked like a man who'd just realized the job he'd been promised didn't exist. And Diane? Diane's mouth was open, but nothing came out. I picked up my fork. The scallop was perfect. I took one bite, set the fork back down, and set it. Clearly, to no one in particular and everyone at once. He learned to cook in my kitchen. No dramatics, no explanation, just a sentence that landed on the table like a deed of ownership, because that's what it was. Declan didn't flinch. He nodded once, the way a man nods at a truth he's carried for 12 years, and walked back into his kitchen. The dining room was silent, except for the sound of someone's water glass meeting the table a little too hard. At the long table, Diane's hands had curled into fists on the cloth. The frame wasn't just cracked anymore. It was hanging by a nail. Patricia Engel crossed the dining room. She moved with the deliberate calm of a woman who'd negotiated hotel deals on 4 continents and could smell a power shift from 30 feet off. She stopped at the chef's table and put out her hand. Vivian Hollis. Not a question. You pitched the Howard flagship in Atlanta last March. The rooftop concept with the vertical garden. I shook her hand. And again in June. And again in June, she smiled. You run Keystone. The room heard it. Every syllable. I didn't look at the long table, but I could feel Daniel shifting in his chair. Could feel Whitney's whisper cut off mid-sentence. Could feel Diane's fists tighten another degree. Patricia pulled a stool up next to me at the counter. I've been looking forward to meeting the rest of the team tonight, she said. But the pitch, the pro forma, the staffing model, the build schedule, that was all your work. It was. I thought so. She leaned in. Between us, the gentleman at the cocktail reception in January, Daniel, he's charming, but he couldn't answer a single question about the revenue model. I said nothing. She nodded as if my silence confirmed something she'd already decided. I'll have my office send a revised LOI on Monday, addressed correctly this time. She didn't say, to you. She didn't have to. She patted the counter once, stood, and walked back toward the bar. At the long table, 14 people sat in a silence so complete I could hear the candle wicks hissing. Daniel's chair scraped the floor as he turned to look at me. I looked back, not with anger, not with triumph, just with the bone-deep calm of a woman who'd finally stopped covering for the lie. The first to move was Whitney. She leaned across the table and grabbed Daniel's arm. "What is she talking about?" she hissed. "Who runs the company?" Daniel opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. He looked like a fish lifted out of the water and set on a countertop, gills working, eyes blank. Diane hadn't moved. Her hands were still on the cloth, flat now, the fists unclenched, as if she'd realized that gripping the surface wasn't going to stop the ground from shifting. The garden club women traded glances, the rapid, calculating kind that meant the story was already being filed away for Monday brunch. Brad reached for his water glass and missed it entirely. The Howard regional director cleared his throat and pretended to study the menu. And I sat at the chef's counter with a perfect plate of scallops and a place card bearing my name, watching the room I'd been excluded from rearrange itself around a truth that had been sitting in a Navy folder the whole time. Nobody asked me to explain. Nobody accused me of lying. The silence was the loudest confirmation I'd ever heard, and I still hadn't opened the folder. I reached into my bag and set the navy folder on the chef's counter. The leather was soft under my fingers. The Keystone logo caught the candlelight. I unzipped it slowly, not for drama, but because I wanted to be precise, the way I'd been precise about everything I'd ever built. "Daniel," I said. My voice was even. "I'm going to read something. I'd like you to listen." He didn't answer. I wasn't asking permission. I pulled out the operating agreement and opened it to Article 3. Keystone Hospitality Group, LLC. Membership interest. Vivian Hollis, 70%. Daniel R. Marsh, 10%. Harove Capital Partners, 20%. I looked up. Every face at the long table stared back. Patricia Engel stood by the bar, arms crossed, expression neutral. Declan leaned against the kitchen pass, watching. "You signed this 9 years ago, Daniel. You signed the acknowledgement every year since. Your 10% stake entitles you to a salary and a distribution schedule. It does not entitle you to the company." Diane stood up. Her chair made a sound like a gunshot on the hardwood. "This is absurd. Daniel built that company from nothing." "Diane," I turned to her, "you're welcome to read the document yourself. Page 4, paragraph 2. The founding member is listed by name. It isn't Daniel." I laid the agreement flat on the counter where anyone could see it. 9 years of signatures. 9 years of capital contributions. Mine. 9 years of a man who'd never read the paperwork, signing his name at the bottom of a page that said, in plain language, that his wife owned the company he'd told everyone was his. The room was so quiet I could hear the ice melting in someone's water glass. Diane's lower lip trembled, not with sorrow, with something closer to fury trying to dress itself up as pain. I looked at her across the dining room, across the long table, across the empty space where my chair should have been. "Funny," I said. "The staff owns the place." Diane erupted. Not the way a reasonable person confronts a difficult truth. The way a woman who spent 25 years building a false ceiling watches it come down. "After everything this family gave you." Her voice cracked on the word family, like a windshield meeting a rock. "We took you in. We gave you a name. We introduced you to people you'd never have met on your own. And this is how you repay us?" I said nothing. "You were nobody, Vivian. Nobody. A girl who smelled like a kitchen. Daniel gave you a life." "Daniel gave me a business card," I said. "I gave him the business." Diane's hands were shaking. She turned to Daniel, expecting reinforcement, expecting the son she'd trained to perform to stand and perform one last time. Whitney was already crying. Not for me. Not for Daniel. For the operational role she'd promised Brad. The income stream she'd been counting on. The seat at a table that had just been pulled out from under her. "This isn't legal," Whitney said. You can't take it." "I'm not taking anything," I said. "I'm keeping what's mine." Brad stared at the tablecloth. The garden club women wore the wide-eyed, faintly thrilled look of people who'd just been handed 6 months of brunch material. The Howard regional director was already on his phone. And Diane kept going, louder, faster, the performance crumbling in real time. She called me ungrateful. She called me cold. She said I'd never understand what family meant. Through all of it, I sat at the chef's counter with my hands folded and my voice level. I never raised it once. There was nothing to raise it for. The documents were on the table. The truth was in the room. And the woman who'd called me staff was standing in a restaurant owned by a man I'd trained, screaming at the woman who owned the company that paid for her lifestyle. When the noise finally died down, and it always dies down, the way a kitchen fire goes out the second you cut the gas, I spoke. "Here's what happens Monday. Francis Doyle, my attorney, files the managing partner removal notice under Article 7 of the operating agreement. Daniel's role as managing partner terminates with 60 days written notice. The agreement allows removal by majority member vote without cause. I don't even need a reason. But if anyone asks, 6 years of misrepresenting his authority to clients and investors, a capital account he never funded, and telling his own family he owned a company that was never his. It's all on the record." Daniel made a sound, not a word. Something between a gasp and the start of a sentence that never arrived. "The salary stops," I continued. "The distributions stop. The title stops. Brad will not be offered a position because there is no position to offer. The company isn't hiring family members who can't explain a food cost ratio. Whitney flinched. Howren will be notified that all future correspondence should be directed to me. Patricia has already indicated her office will reissue the LOI under the correct contact. I looked at Daniel. And I'm filing for divorce. My attorney will handle the asset separation. The operating agreement is clear on what belongs to the company and what belongs to the marriage. You'll find they don't overlap much. Nobody spoke. Diane had sunk back into her chair, her face blotchy, her hands gripping the armrests. Whitney was typing furiously on her phone, calling a lawyer probably, or Googling, "Can my sister-in-law fire my husband?" Brad had pushed his chair back from the table like a man preparing to leave a building on fire. The 14 place cards sat undisturbed in their copper ink, and the 15th, mine, glowed under the kitchen lights at the chef's counter, exactly where it belonged. Daniel stood. His chair scraped the floor again, and every head in the room turned. For 1 second, one honest, unguarded second, he looked at me the way he used to, back when we first met, when I was restructuring his failing bar, and he watched me like I was the most capable person he'd ever seen. "Mom," he said. His voice was rough. "She built all of it." The room held its breath. Diane looked at her son with an expression I'd never seen on her. Not anger, not manipulation, but fear. Real fear. The kind that comes when the performance stops and there's nothing behind the curtain. Daniel opened his mouth again, and I saw it. The fork in the road. The moment where he could have chosen the truth. He could have turned to me and said, "I knew. I knew the whole time." And I was too afraid to say it. Instead, he turned to his mother. "I'm sorry, Mom. I should have managed this better." Managed. Not told the truth. Not stood by my wife. Managed. The word hung in the air like smoke. He reached for Diane's hand. She took it, her chin trembling, already composing the version of this story she'd tell at Garden Club. The one where Vivienne was the villain, where Daniel was the victim, where the Marshes were a good family ambushed by an ungrateful wife. I watched him choose her. I watched him choose the frame over the picture, the performance over the person. The mother who'd taught him that love was a thing you staged for an audience. And something inside my chest let go. Not with a crack, but with a click, like a lock releasing. "I'm not leaving the table," I said. "I'm leaving the marriage." I picked up my bag. I picked up the navy folder. And I walked out of Sen the same way I'd walked into every kitchen since I was 16. Upright, steady, ready for whatever came next. The parking lot was cool, May in the Low Country. The jasmine was blooming, the air thick and sweet enough to make you forget that 20 minutes ago you detonated the central lie of a 6-year marriage in front of 14 witnesses and a James Beard nominee. Declan caught me at my car. He'd shed the chef's coat and stood there in a plain white t-shirt, arms folded, looking at me with the steady expression of a man who'd seen this coming before I did. "You good?" "I'm good." "You need anything?" "A decent night's sleep and a real estate attorney." He almost smiled. "I'll have the scallops boxed up for you." "Keep them. Feed the staff." He nodded. Then he did something Declan never did in public. He hugged me again and held on. "Chef," he said quietly into my shoulder, "thank you for all of it." I drove home with the windows down and the radio off, the Navy folder riding shotgun. The house was dark when I got there. Daniel wasn't home. I hadn't expected him to be. I changed into sweats, made a cup of tea, and sat at the kitchen counter, the same spot where I'd read the Marsh family group chat 24 hours earlier. The screen was dark now. The counter was clean. The jasmine drifted in through the open window. I didn't cry. I wasn't sad. I was the particular kind of calm that comes after you've carried a weight so long that setting it down feels like floating. Monday went the way Mondays go when you've spent the weekend preparing. Francis filed the removal notice at 9 a.m. By noon, Daniel's access to Keystone's accounts, email, and project management systems was suspended. By 3, his corporate card was deactivated. He called me twice. I didn't answer. Whitney's husband, Brad, received a formal letter rescinding the informal offer that had never been put in writing, because Diane's brunch promises don't survive contact with an operating agreement. Patricia Engel's office sent a revised letter of intent for the Howard flagship, addressed to Vivian K. Hollis, managing member, Keystone Hospitality Group. The project budget came to $4.2 million. My name was on every page. The divorce filing went through on Wednesday. Asset separation was clean. Francis had structured the operating agreement specifically to keep company assets distinct from marital property. Daniel kept the house, the car, and his 10% equity stake, frozen pending an independent appraisal Francis estimated would take 4 to 6 months. I kept Keystone. I kept the Howard contract. I kept the 9 years of sweat and silence and 6 a.m. site walks and midnight spreadsheets that had built everything the Marshes thought was theirs. Diane did not call. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that she'd told the garden club I'd had a breakdown at dinner. The garden club women, who had watched the entire thing unfold, politely changed the subject. 2 months later, I walked into Keystone's new flagship space for the first time. The build-out was just beginning. Bare concrete, exposed wiring, the smell of sawdust and possibility. On the counter where the host stand would eventually stand, Declan had left a single place card, copper ink on cream stock. Vivian Hollis, owner. A chair only means something if the room believes you need their permission to sit. I stopped asking for permission the night I understood that the table had been set against me long before I arrived. That's my story. One missing chair, one smirk, and a company they never bothered to read the paperwork on. If this reminded you that what you built should carry your name, go check whose name is really on the things you've made. Do it this week. Share this with someone who needs the nudge. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.